find a peaceful solution to the problem of Vietnam. I don't think that there's any chance of finding that peaceful solution at the present time, although I'm in favor of making every kind of effort to do so and to demonstrate to our own people and around the world that we are interested in finding a peaceful solution. But I think that Hanoi and the Viet Cong and the National Front and the Chinese are convinced that the United States is going to turn and run from Vietnam. They felt that the French were going to do it in 1954. There was dissension within France. They see the same kind of dissension within the United States. They think that there, as General Dieppe said in his speech last spring, the Americans are going to say, bring the boys home by Christmas, that they aren't going to remain there, that we don't have the tenacity or the will to remain. So that therefore they think that the war is going in their direction, and that they there's no sense in any sitting down to any negotiating discussions, that they've had negotiations before and discussions before and sat down at a conference table and they felt they've always come out badly. They thought they would do much better in the 1955 discussions and felt that they were betrayed by Molotov. So that they don't wish to come back to a conference table because they think the United States will get out, that they think they can win the war in the South. I think that our greatest problem, therefore, is to prove that we're going to remain in Vietnam. Now that war, that struggle in Vietnam, therefore, in my judgment, is going to be costly. It's going to be long. It's going to be much bloodier than it is at the present time. And we're going to have the commitment of a great number of more troops than we have at the present time. I would think that the estimate of 400,000 troops by the end of the year is probably accurate, and the fact that it will grow even more next year. And the casualties would be considerably higher than they are at the present time as far as America.
Robert F. Kennedy speaking on February 14, 1966. David Embledge now joins us from Boston. He was a student at St. Lawrence University in New York. Embledge recorded Kennedy's speech and has provided exclusively to Democracy Now! Today, he's an assistant professor of writing, literature, and publishing at Emerson College in Massachusetts. Welcome to Democracy Now!, David Embledge. This might surprise some people as they listen to Robert F. Kennedy in 1966, 2 years before he ran for president.
Well, it certainly does seem like a surprise nowadays looking backwards on it because, of course, we want to remember Bobby Kennedy, most of us who worked for him, as an anti-war candidate. And, of course, it took him quite some time to get to that position.
Can you explain that transition? In a moment, we'll play a few minutes of a speech he gave in 1968. But during this period, defending the Vietnam War, and your thoughts as a student at St. Lawrence?
Well, my own thoughts at the time, I think, were probably quite similar to the thoughts of thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of other students around the country, that many of us had moved out ahead of where the political leaders were, certainly out ahead of where Robert Kennedy was. Most of us were already opposed to the war in Vietnam. I myself ended up resisting the war in all sorts of ways and ultimately filing a claim as a conscientious objector. I managed to avoid the war with a medical deferment and a string of deferments for my education and teaching. I was probably quite typical in that respect. So in some respects, the Robert Kennedy we hear in this speech in 1966 was behind us, following the development of our own political thinking. And I think it was really the initiative of Senator Eugene McCarthy who won the presidential primary in New Hampshire, that I think it was that on an anti-war campaign that really woke Robert Kennedy up to the fact that there was a movement afoot on which Kennedy could capitalize, and probably should capitalize, because by the time McCarthy had achieved his victory in New Hampshire, public opinion had shifted quite significantly in the direction of seriously questioning the commitment in Vietnam.
Those remarks that you recorded at St. Lawrence University were 2 years before Robert F. Kennedy entered the race for the Democratic nomination. As a candidate, Kennedy took a more critical stance on Vietnam, although he still refused to call for an immediate U.S. withdrawal. This is an excerpt of Kennedy's speech at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles, April 19, 1968.
My first point really is that I think the problem has been that we made it America's war. And that I think that we made it a military conflict, and I think it's far more complicated than that.
I should say at the beginning that I was involved in an administration that where we became more and more involved in Vietnam. So when there's blame to be assessed about what is happening in Vietnam and the difficult problems that we're facing in Vietnam, that administration of President Kennedy has to share its responsibility, and certainly I do as well. I was a member of the National Security Council. I was involved in some of those matters at that time. So I don't say these things on the basis of blaming anybody or any person or any administration, but rather at what I think I recognize from my own experience and my own mistakes and the direction that we're moving at the moment. I think we looked on it as a military conflict, that we killed as enough of them compared to how many we were going to be killed of our own army that they would eventually give up. I think it was much more than that. I think that as we started to send large numbers of American troops, that the people of South Vietnam looked upon it more and more as an American war, that it was white man's war, that it was the continuation of the French effort to control Vietnam, and therefore they didn't associate themselves with that effort, an effort of independence and an effort of freedom, but either became more neutral or associated themselves with the National Liberation Front or the Viet Cong. The result is, of course, the recruitment of the NLF grew tremendously over the period of the last 2 or 3 years. There's no question we were killing large numbers of them. But if you look at the figures of who we were killing, the Army was wiped out every year. But in fact, the Army grew from January 66 to January 67. It increased by 50% during the same period of time, according to our own figures. Plus the mortally wounded, or those who were so badly wounded they couldn't enter the conflict anymore, everybody would have been dead. So I think that their recruitment program has been successful. The military effort that we have made and concentrated on that, I think, has been a mistake. Third, I think that we have not made it clear enough that the government in Vietnam has to end its corruption and the dishonesty. I think
Robert F. Kennedy speaking April 19th, 1968, less than 2 months before his own assassination. It was exactly 2 weeks after Dr. King's assassination. Before we go on to the United Farm Workers and his stance with the farm workers, David Emblich, I'd like to ask you for your final